What's up, bros? Welcome to the very first Brograph Breakdown. I'm Dave Koss, and we're going to be breaking down motion graphics and talking about how they were made, and I thought I would start out with something that I actually worked on. Our client at Holmes Millett Advertising was Haynes & Boone. It's one of the largest law firms in Texas, has 12 cities in the United States and abroad, and they asked us to produce their annual animated holiday card. So before we talk about it, let's go ahead and watch it first. So Haynes & Boone's holiday cards are traditionally well known for their top honors in the awards that they've gotten from legal marketing associations that they're members of. And one of their most popular videos in the past was a stop motion practical animation that they did. So it was very well received, and that one specifically won top honors, and all their other ones have too. But what we wanted to do was come up with something this year. We worked with Haynes & Boone to come up with something that was similar, kind of had the same feel, but kind of have a new twist. So it's all paper this time, again, like their original one that was done in stop motion. But this time we put a different twist on it by doing 3D and designing everything in 3D. So I'm going to go over a little bit of how we put that together and the design process, the step-by-step on that. And you'll be able to see how we go from concept to completion in this. Now, we really wanted to come up with something that was just as special as the original. So we worked a little bit and started on initial design concepts. So our initial design concept usually starts with something that's a little more broad, so we can kind of fine-tune the idea, and we say, here's what we'd like to do, here's what we'd like to convey, and we'll either draw up some examples or show some similar examples of what we want to do, and say, here are the different pieces of samples and what we'd like to do to combine this, and we're going to take this and make a storyboard out of it. You can see Jeff there prepping the storyboard, and then we'll actually take those sketches and those pieces of the storyboard and put them into an animatic. So let's take a look at the animatic and see what it initially looked like. Now you can see it's pretty basic here. It's just a document with the sketches in it. You can see you've got the dove going around the skater, flying around through the scene, going through the window by the fire, and coming back out. And what we decided to do is kind of switch it up so at the end the bird would land on the window and see the family dining in there. So this is a little bit out of order. You can see we changed that from the original. The bird goes around the carousel there, like you saw. There's the snowman, and then it kind of ends with happy holidays on a letter. So at that point we had to figure out how we were going to do that in a 3D environment. Brian began actually mocking up in 3D kind of a blocking scene, and what that does for us is allow us to figure out how our moves are going to work, how the dove is going to interact, and make sure that all of the camera movements are going to actually work the way we kind of see them in our head, because sometimes you can see it in your head and then you try and do it technically, and then you realize that there are some limitations. So he blocked everything out and used a lot of stand-ins, different shapes and stuff like that. We had a couple pieces of sample artwork that we had done already, so we put them in there, and that really helped us to get the timing going. You can see here that we're just using some basic shapes. This is just a basic render. We made the dove placeholder red so that it kind of stood out and you could see how that was going to work. And this really helps as far as music and everything is concerned, because we already had the music selected, and we were able to edit it down to the time that we wanted it to be. We wanted it to be about 30 seconds. And this helped us get all of that timing down and make sure that it was going to work. The camera moves weren't going to be too fast, to fit within that 30 seconds. You can see here's the carousel. The carousel was a bit more evolved at this point because as Brian was doing the blocking, I was actually starting to work on the 3D pieces, and I had started with the carousel. So that was a little more detailed in the blocking scene once it got there, because we were able to put that in for this render. And you can see the Sledders here coming down. And then over here, fly through, and we go to the window, and this is where the house would be. So this is extremely helpful. Now this scene was actually done to scale. We kind of came up with a scene scale that we thought was going to work as far as, what would these pieces be in real life. So Hollis was actually designing the illustrations at the same time. We kind of start working on pieces of this together so that it kind of saves us on time. And as he was working on these illustrations, he was exporting these with slight outlines around them, so then I could take that alpha channel and I could use that as the cutout for the paper. The paper was all done in Cinema 4D, and on top of that paper layer with that alpha channel that he gave me, then I put his artwork on top of it. From the beginning, we decided as well we were going to come up with a look, and it's best to kind of test all of that ahead of time. So you can see here's the initial skater with Hollis's artwork on top of it, and you can see here's that paper outline that was created. So that's a texture developed in Cinema 4D, and so this is kind of a base layer, and then we've got some other tests that we did. You can see how there's bump mapping and specular, so this isn't completely flat. It gives it kind of a nice shine when the light hits it at certain angles, kind of like it's a laminated piece of paper. That's really what we were going for, especially on the carousel. You can see that. And here we go with some of the night stuff. We wanted to do, half of this as a night scene like you saw, so we worked with different lights to get that look right, and see how you've got that kind of a laminated look on the ground. That's what we were going for there. And here is the carousel without texturing. This is the same thing. You've got the nice little sheen going on here, so it looks like laminated paper. And you can see some of the GI and ambient occlusion going on here. And here's the top when we started adding textures. And then this is the carousel after we added more colored paper textures to it. And these are the original horses, which were kind of just a stand-in. And once we got all the other horses done and the actual artwork done, we replaced them. On the snow, you can see what we did was give it more of a plastic look. We were going for something that was more of a scene that you would buy at the store, like a little miniature scene with plastic hills of snow and then maybe different characters in it. So we weren't going for actual snow. We were trying to make this look like it was something that you would buy at the store that you would set on your on a shelf or something during the holidays. Then here are some of the initial bird tests. You've got just a generic environment that we were using just to get some natural lighting, and just different shots of the wings up and the wings down just to make sure it looked how we wanted it to look. And you can see here that this is kind of what our scene looked like from far away. It's mostly flat. You've got the buildings here, and then we built in, actually Brian did the snow banks and set them up in such a way to where they're strategically placed in front of the camera and behind to kind of fill out the shots. When you have the bird flying past someone and they're like in the left side of the scene, to kind of balance out the shot, you put snowbanks in the right place, sometimes more in the foreground, the background, just so everything looks balanced. Now here's where we started building the desk scene for the beginning. We wanted this to look a little bit different, a little more like real life before you go into the fantasy card. So we started building a desk. This is the initial concept, and you can see that the card has artwork that matches the inside of the card. And at first we had some tree balls. We decided to go for something a little bit different. We didn't really like that. The desk, I think we changed a little bit. And what was real nice, though, is that we're working with Octane render engine. And so, for example, here is the original 3D model of the gift that we had. We decided to put the gift there instead because it looked a lot better. And you can see here it is. And using Octane is real nice because we were able to put that in and get that texture just right, fairly easy, fairly quickly, and look at it in the scene very fast. You can see what's going on here with the texture and the reflections and the normals mapping. We used something called Crazy Bump that actually let us create normals and bump maps for stuff like this. This really has a feeling like it's kind of that glossy, reflective wrapping paper, and to be able to rotate around that in real time was absolutely amazing using Octane. And then here you can see the final shot here at the end. And then this is one of our production stills as well. So here's some of our textures. I'll go through and just show what we built and what some of the different elements are. We've got buildings for the card at the beginning. There's actually, kind of a flat texture on the card itself, and then where it says Season's Greetings, and for certain features of the bird, we actually wanted kind of a specular shine on that, and a bump, so that when the page turned and flipped, it caught the light in such a way where it had more of a realistic feel, like it had kind of a glossy finish on certain parts of the card. Now here is one of the initial concepts of the dove. It changed a bit as the process went on, but you can see how we kind of laid out how we wanted it to actually be like a paper dove that you would find online and maybe print and cut out and put together yourself. So it still had that paper kind of feel. And here's the fire. There were 3 different layers, and those were just on planes that went back and forth. And we have some initial concepts of the card here before we had all the artwork. You can see that our tests worked pretty well. The card takes off, and you can see where that shine is. See how the shine hits only on the artwork itself and not on the card. And we kept that look and we kept that feel and that shine and that gloss, but we made better artwork for it that matched what we were doing. Here are the final versions of the horses or ponies for the carousel, which turned out great. And then we have various paper textures here of different colors. And this is what we used. We kind of had a palette going for that. In fact, I've got kind of a swatch here. And you can see these were the main colors we were using. So at any time, if we needed a specific color, it most likely had to be one of these colors. On occasion, we would have to pull something like a red just because we had to. But this was the palette that we went with. Right here, you can actually see some of the bump mapping and normal mapping for the Christmas present. So you can see there's the texture. It was initially red. We changed that to match the palette. And then here's the normal map for it, and here's the bump map. Now there's actually a scene in The Simpsons that I like, which I thought was a good example of how the camera flow needed to go. As I scroll through, you can see the different actions happen, and the camera follows as the next action comes in. And so that was actually my thought on these camera moves. You can see a little transition happens with the marble. Somebody throws a frisbee, transitions into the next scene. That was kind of the feel that we wanted to go with. This is a sky photo. This is an HDR map that we used, and this was on the sky in the whole scene, and it actually was used as a way to light the scene. So there wasn't much done as far as lighting other than this. There were just certain accent lights to bring out certain areas, and that was about it. Here we've got the sleigh. And then we have pieces of the horse from the beginning that was on the sleigh, and the different pieces were made separately so we could cut them out and put little brads on them to make them look like something that somebody maybe cut out and put together and then stuck the legs in there so that they could move independently if you wanted them to. Here's a snowman. Here's the spiral that we put on the floor, the inside of the carousel. And here is one of the trees. And here's the other tree. And what we also did on this card is we made a Spanish version of this as well. So that was a separate render that we put separate artwork on, and this is what it looked like. As far as audio is concerned, we had actually a lot of Foley that we added after the fact. Some of it a little louder than others, some of it just a little subtle, but it really added a lot. It really made it feel made it come together and feel like there was a real scene going on there. You know, if you watch the scene without any of the sound effects, it's night and day. Like it's really dead if you don't have all these little sounds going on. So they added an awful lot to it. With the audio, it was actually done with binaural sounds. So all the individual sound effects and everything are panned according to their place on the screen. So if you put on headphones, you can really tell that the sounds are moving around. You can they almost feel like they're behind you because it's done with the binaural audio, binaural panning. So, you know, if something comes by and it goes around and behind you, like for example, the Sledders, they come down the hill and they go up over the hill, and you kind of hear it go behind you in your head like they passed you. That really adds a lot to it too if you're listening with headphones. So we had a lot of sound effects. Here's some birds flapping, and we use this as our dove. And then we've got the children, which we use for the carousel, and we also used for the kids going down the hill. And then horse whines. And then actually this here is a skateboard sound, which I used for multiple things. I used it for the ice skater, and I used it for the Sledders because it makes that sound like, you know, either skates on ice or sleds on snow, and skateboard sounds close enough to that it worked really well. Now with Octane, again, what was so great is we were able to see a lot of this stuff in real time. So here is the gift, and if I start the Octane preview window, it'll bring up what we're working on here. You can see these reflections in real time. We took a lot of these extra little pieces out because there's too much clutter to put on the desk, but we were able to tweak the reflections and everything in real time to get it just right, including the color. Because, you know, when you're working with a color palette and then you bring it into 3D, and you've got all these different variables like lighting and texturing and specular and reflection, that's going to change the colors quite a bit, just, you know, by being more of in a physical environment. So we were able to tweak these colors on the fly and make sure that they match the color palette. For example, like if I wanted to change this, you know, to any color right here, I mean, it's just like that, very, very quick, very easy to do. You can even change the roughness and make some of this look a little bit different. I could change the bump as well. Clear that out, take out the normals, and you can kind of see what it looked like without just straight up reflecting. Doesn't look as cool that way, but super fast and easy to tweak on the fly. Now here is the main scene. You can see if I zoom out here, this is what the different pieces look like. And I'm going to kind of break down the different areas, and you'll be able to see what we did. Now, to start out, I had some special Octane lights that were following just the dove, because he's kind of the main character, and we want to make sure that he's lighted most of the time, all the way, and doesn't kind of fall into the shadows or anything like that. So they're not super bright lights or anything like that, but it just kept him in focus the whole time. Now, the other thing that we had in here was these slider bars, and I actually used Espresso scripts on that. I've got some Espresso right here. I've got the tail and the wing, very simple when it comes down to it. So if you look at the Dove, there's actually user data here where I set limits on how far the tail could go, and I set limits on how far the wings could go. That really helps to animate because you don't have to worry about pulling the wings in too far down, too far up. So as we were going through getting the wings to move at just the right times, it was real simple to go up here and actually just adjust the wing and add a keyframe. Adjust the tail like this and add a keyframe. And in general, the way that I went about doing the wing keyframes is to start flapping to get the bird up in the air, and then once it was going in a downward motion, the wings would kind of settle in and just stay there. And then if the bird was going to head back up in any direction, I would start the wings flapping again, and then stop, let it do a glide, and then start flapping again. Especially if there's a lot of turns and stuff, just keep the wings going, and then tilt the bird in whatever direction he was heading in. That was a separate one. Now if you look down at how I had this set up, I had position, heading, pitch, and bank all in separate nulls because that helps with the control so that you're not worried about having multiple rotation keyframes within the same null, because that just gets a little more confusing. Just like to keep them separate. You can see the wings here were actually symmetry objects, so you just do one and the other moves in symmetry. The tail's kind of the same thing. Had a little bit of a wrap and a bend going on it. And then here's the head. Everything in this scene was extruded. So what I didn't want everything to look like was a completely flat plane. You know, if everything was a complete flat plane, then when you turn and you go around the paper, there would be a point where you would see nothing at all. But in this case, there is some thickness to it. I don't know how well you can see it on the screen here, but there's thickness to everything. So they all are technically extrudes. So that really makes these feel a little bit more real. I've done some stuff in the past where there was basically no geometry. You know, it's just all flat planes. I mean, technically geometry, but you know, alphas on planes just don't translate as actual paper. We did do that with the trees back here because they were a little more problematic, I guess is the word. So they're just straight alpha cutouts, I believe, and there's just too many splines here, and it just got a little too confusing. And then the geometry, the amount of geometry that goes into doing all of these little branches would kind of bog down the scene. We're trying to keep the scene as simple as possible so that Octane is able to chew through this relatively quick. The more complicated splines and geometry, smoothing, all of that kind of stuff gets, the longer it takes for an Octane scene to kind of load initially. So I wanted to keep it quick so we could just, you know, do a little tweak, and then we could open up our Octane window and see the results pretty quick. The one thing that I learned with Octane is to keep my splines only as detailed as they need to be. So, for example, some of these sleigh splines and stuff that you see here, I'm actually doing uniform points in order to make sure that I can have complete control over how detailed they are. Any splines that were set to adaptive at like 0 really became problematic. So it was just a matter of going in and kind of setting the resolution of those splines manually. On the carousel, you can see here are step by step the different pieces coming in. So there's a lot of sweeps going on here with this paper moving up. There's a lot of bounce going on where generally what I'll do is go to my final keyframe of how I want something to land. I'll set that, and then I'll go about 10 keyframes or 10 frames or so back, and I'll scale it all the way down. And then I'll go after I set that in and out point, I'll actually move back forward to almost the end, and I'll kind of overscale and keyframe the object. That way, when it plays back, it kind of bounces up and then back down to where it needs to be. I'll play that out here and you can kind of see. You can see it a lot in this little piece right here. If I go forward, it gets bigger right here, and then a couple frames later it kind of lands. And just about every piece does that, except for these sweeps. They come out, they go oversized, and they come back in. That just gives it a really nice feeling that it's all very lively. Once we get over to this section here, all of the natural light kind of changes, and I ended up adding some lights that kind of make it look like dusk. And once the bird comes over to this section over here, there's some lights that fall down on top of the house, and each one has another octane light on it, kind of keeping it lit up. And the issue that you run into whenever you turn off all that natural light is how many samples you're going to have in Octane. You know, when you got this big open scene here and you've got all this stuff reflecting each other and the natural light and some of the other lights that you have in the scene, there's very little grain, and so I was only having to render at about 500 samples at that point. But once you get over here and all those other lights turn off, that's when all the grain starts to happen, because you only have a few lights lighting the whole thing. So once we got to this point, it was super, super grainy, to the point where I think we had to go up to even 6,000 samples. And so that becomes a little more time consuming. It's very much worth it because it looks really clean once you get it to that point, but we're talking 15-20 minutes a frame at that point, which, you know, it's a short area. It's something you can let render overnight. But the solution was to render the whole thing out first with just the 500 samples, because for the most part the scene was going to be fine. At the end, to clean that up, we just rendered from about this point when the lights are going down, when the dove is right here, to the end at 6,000 samples per frame. And once we got into post, we kind of crossfaded those two scenes together, those two different renders together, and you could barely tell that there was anything going on. I mean, if you look for it, you could probably see a little bit of grain fading away at that point, but it really, really brought out the characters, especially these guys. These the guy playing with the kid with the puppy coming out of the box. Their features are kind of hard to see just because of the nature of the artwork. And once the higher samples were rendered, the seams between the actual paper on their head and then the actual artwork that was a similar color, it really came out, which you couldn't see that before when it was a little bit grainier. Octane was really able to help us get our look, and as we talked about earlier, we had these different sample scenes, and what's so great about being able to see this in real time is that if you change your different lights, you can see them on the fly. So if I turn off all the night lights and turn back on my day lights that I had as samples, you can really get an idea of what it's going to look like. And not only that, but you've got your camera tag, which allows you to mess with your looks, mess with your exposure and stuff like that within the scene to make sure that everything's going to work the way you think it will. It also lets you kind of create a look based on the camera response. We used Kodachrome 25 for this. I think it was a good look, but you know, we went through basically all of these different camera looks as well, with different color temperatures and with different camera responses to get the right feel. And there's kind of a balance that happens where you've got to find the look that you want and kind of mix that with your lighting look and even your brightnesses, your contrast, your light intensities, your light color temperatures and exposure, and of course f-stop. Also, what we did here, because these are paper, you can't really have these things traveling around the carousel without getting lost, because they're not 3D horses like you would have in real life, where the pole goes through the center of them. So what I did was put a target onto them. So you've got horse target, which is right here, and I just put that basically where the camera was going to be, so that as the camera is passing by, none of the horses tend to look away from the camera, because if they did, you would kind of catch the sides of them and it wouldn't look as good. So you can see if I just grab this camera target here, move them around, the horses actually follow it. So if it's set in the right place, they will follow. So if I moved over here, let's say, see, this is what they would look like. You would kind of lose that feeling, and so you just grab that target and you move it to where you are, and there we go. They follow you. Texture wise, what we did was multi-layer. As I talked about earlier, the paper was all kind of set, so there are actually base texture layers here. If I go to all my textures, you can see there's a ton of textures, and a lot of them are based on the texture numbers I have here at the bottom. Now they're numbered for what number they are in our master palette, and they all have a base paper texture, and you can see that here. This is the base paper texture. This is where I got the specular and the bump mapping and everything exactly how I wanted it, as a blank sheet of paper. And then I went to these other pieces here and put in the same exact piece of paper, except colorized it. Now all of these colors were used as the base for all of these other ones. Most of them actually just used the white paper. But for example, we'll go to the Sledders, and you can see the Sledders here and what they look like. All of this edge right here is paper. And then we have a separate PNG file that has the artwork on it that Hollis did. So if I go to the snowman scene here, I actually put the Sledders in. You've got kid and kid, because there's two textures, and that's because you've got the texture that is the base texture, which would be this here. It's got the artwork on it. And then you have a mixed texture, and this mixed texture took in the base paper texture and the kid texture at the same time. Now if you go to the top layer, which is the artwork that's on top of the paper, then put an alpha in so that it would cut out the alpha from that PNG. And when it mixes the texture with the paper, it not only puts that bump and that texture into the artwork, but then you can see the paper around it, and that gives it a feel like that was a piece of artwork in a book or something, and somebody cut it out and stuck it on a little stick. And the sticks are made out of that same kind of paper texture too. As far as After Effects goes, here's what we have. Here's the final scene. I got a proxy on right now, but you can see there's a lot of depth of field going on. We've got a focus thing happening here, and we've got motion blur. Motion blur was done with RSMB after the fact. I honestly, if it works, I prefer doing it that way. You can see motion blur and the depth applied to the snow as well. Brian did the snow, which was, it turned out great. He used particular, but what we did was took the final camera motion from Cinema 4D and exported it, and then brought that into After Effects, combined that with particular, and he was able to make a separate snow channel. And then we just used object buffers to kind of cut out the areas where we wanted the snow to fall behind. Same thing applied with the sparkles. We had object buffers for those. So if I open the object buffers, we had actually 9 different object buffers. You can see here's one for just the dove. So that when the dove went behind things, you were able to pull those masks that you needed. And then you've got layers for different characters, and these were kind of combined. If there's objects that are kind of separate throughout the scene, I'll use the same object buffer for them because they don't coincide with each other in any way. So there are those object buffers. Number 3, let's see what number 3 was. Number 3 was the Sledders. And we didn't necessarily use all of these either. I just wanted to have them just in case. We have one for the buildings in the background. We've got one for just the floor, in case we wanted to do any adjustments to the floor, and or the opposite, if we wanted to make adjustments to all of the characters and possibly the sky. Here's one for just the trees, in case we needed to adjust the tree levels. I think some of the trees in the background, I ended up making them a little bit darker. Same thing with these, and these trees were done separate. We have one that is just sky, so we can make adjustments to what the sky looks like. One of the things that I did do with the background is add gradients to the existing texture that we had on it, and this is how I did that. I just had regular gradients, and depending on what part of it you're in, like if you head down here where the scene starts to get darker, the gradient that was on the background of this, if I go back to the original scene, actually starts to turn kind of more of a purple and orange as the sun goes down, and then eventually, you know, just goes, you know, completely more to a dark, deep blue. You see the gradients that's going on here. Now there's also an overall vignette that's over the whole thing, as well as kind of a front blur that was put on, and the front blur is there to kind of give a tilt shift look. Basically, you take anything and you add a front and rear blur, and it's going to make it look small and miniature, and that was what we were going for here. Since this is supposed to be a small scene, it really adds a lot when you see like this blur going right here on the foot of the skater. That really makes it feel like it's a miniature scene. So here is the base render, and you can see it really does look a lot different. You know, in order to make something look really nice out of Cinema 4D, you don't necessarily have to sit there and tweak it all in Cinema 4D. If you can get away with changing a lot of it after the fact, it not only helps in render time, but it helps in convenience as far as being able to manipulate a scene after the fact and see if you like certain things, see if you like certain colors. Being able to use RSMB helps us adjust some of the motion blur if it looks like we have too much motion blur going on. We have a version with no alpha, just in case. Here's our depth scene. So in Cinema 4D, we kind of set where we wanted the front and back of the blur to be for the camera. So everything in white, which is a value 255, is going to be a basically in focus part of the picture, and you can adjust that focus if you want to the other sections, but you know, we wanted the focus to kind of go from the middle of the scene. That's why it's all white up until the middle, and then the focus blur would go from the middle to the back where the buildings are. That would be the area of no blur to lots of blur. And that really worked. And what's great about the Frischluft plugin is that it's all keyframeable and it's doable after the fact. So you don't have to try and set this depth in camera. Technically, I mean, I do think that rendering with depth in Cinema 4D does look more realistic. But in this case, this was nice because we were able to rack focus on the things we wanted to rack focus to. So what you can do, if I take this off of proxy, and we can take a look. In your controls, I'll go to the depth channel that I have here, and you can see it's keyframed. The amount of depth is keyframed, and then the focal points keyframed. So like as the bird goes to the back, you could follow him if you want to. If I take this and I concentrate on this area here, it's pulling the value from that depth channel, bringing that into focus. But if I wanted to move that point, I could move it back here, and I could focus on a building in the background instead based on the gray value of that. And you can see everything here goes out of focus. And then the last part that we put in after the snow was the sparkles on the dove. which is something that Brian came up with. He did many different tests to see what would work the best. He tried some trails, he tried some different colors, really fine-tuned and tweaked that. What we didn't want to do was to make the sparkles look like they were coming out of the back of the dove, because it just wouldn't look right coming out of the butt of the dove. You know, when you look at samples of things like Tinkerbell, for example, the sparkles come, you know, from the back of her when she's flying, but the back of her are her feet, so it's not as bad. You know, if you saw a Disney movie and sparkles were always coming out of Tinkerbell's butt, that would look really weird. So, you know, after doing these different run-throughs, different samples, we decided that the sparkles would be kind of coming off of the back of the dove. We tried with just coming off the sides of the wings as well. It didn't look as good. There's too much going on. You know, we already have so much going on in the scene and snow and everything else. We didn't want 2 particle trails. So we, you know, kind of landed on this, and I think it worked really well. And again, that was done with nulls that were brought in from Cinema 4D and After Effects, used with particular, and then they're brought back into the scene, and then they line up perfect. So I hope you enjoyed this behind the scenes. It's always fun to have a challenge when we're working with stuff like this. We were able to knock this out in about 3 weeks, including render time, which was awesome. I think Octane contributed to that a lot, because we could see what we were doing rather quick and didn't have to do too much as far as test renders. Hopefully this gives you a better idea of what it takes from start to completion and what we kind of do in between when we're working on projects like this. I'm Dave Koss. Hope you enjoyed this breakdown, and I'll talk to you later. Later, bros. It's pretty good, I guess.